Die Sprachübertragung beginnt jetzt. Alle Teilnehmer befinden sich im Zuhörermodus.
Good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Bommer, and I would like to welcome you to our first webinar in 2022, BAI's 25th year of existence, 25 years of sustainable growth now. Just some technical information at the beginning. As usual, you will get a copy of the slides of this webinar afterwards, as well as a recording. And more important, if you have any questions, you might ask them in this GoToWebinar tool in the upper right corner of your screen. So there is a function with question, Fragen. Today's webinar is not like other ones. It is rather an insight in our work of the past month, and it shall be the kickoff of further work and activities. I would therefore also like to take this opportunity to tell you briefly more about our ESG activities, which are inter alia the following ones. We have a permanent working group on sustainable finance and ESG, with which we prepare BAI's opinions for consultations on all levels, be it IOSCO, be it the European Union, the others, the European Commission, or Germany. And this working group is also a platform for dialogue and exchange of information. Members of this working group formed the nucleus of the BAI PAI Best Practices Roundtable for real estate and infrastructure, which is today's topic. As we have done and will do with regard to PAI in illiquid asset classes, we plan also to develop BAI standards for ESG due diligence for alternative investments. We have not started yet, but we will do so. So your participation is also highly welcome in this area. With our webinars, with our workshops, with our alternative investment conference, which we'll hold in May, with a special pre-event on ESG data and research, with keynote speeches, etc., we inform you and the branch and the industry also on ESG topics, as well as we do with our infomails and newsletters with ESG topics. All these offers and activities are for you, BAI members, and the alternative investment industry. Your input and your participation are as desired, as necessary for our work. So please do not hesitate to contact us. The 1st of January of this still young year, 2022, was an important milestone for ESG regulation, especially for disclosure requirements. The Delegated Act containing the technical screening criteria for climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation was published in an official journal and applies since 1st January of this year. Also, the Delegated Act under Article 8 of the Taxonomy Regulation is in force now. In scope undertakings, for instance, those covered by the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, are expected to report their taxonomy eligibility from this 1st January on. Other undertakings will be forced to do so later on, but another important milestone. And also, since the 1st of January, it was also the beginning of the first reference period for entity-level PAI statement. And here we are in the middle of today's webinar topic. What we can see from this slide is the timely misalignment of the various regulatory requirements. For instance, from August 2022 on, sustainability preferences of clients must be ascertained, although information on taxonomy alignment and complete SFDR product disclosures will not be available at this time. Same with regard to our PAI KPIs, their collection and calculation. financial market participants have to start with them since 1st January, although the final SFDR draft will enter into force only 1 year later. What we do at the moment is therefore only based on drafts. Already at the very beginning of the drafts of the SFDR RTS, we warned in our opinions filed to the ESAs about two things primarily: the complexity of the ESG data situation and the wrong chronological order of the various legal acts. Improvements were achieved in some areas, for example, by significantly reducing the number of PAI KPIs from the first to the second draft of the SFDR RTS. The postponement of the RTS also made the implementation somewhat easier, but in turn brought even greater difficulties when you look at the whole regulatory mesh. For instance, the non-postponement, as mentioned before, of the MiFID II provisions. With regard to this timeline, we all and the financial market participants simply have to do what is required. But with regard to ESG data, especially for illiquid alternative asset classes, their non-availability, their insufficiency, their unreliability and complexity, BAI likes with its best practices to offer its members and the industry some assistance and guidance. During the past month, around a dozen persons, experienced asset managers, investors, service providers, scientists, consultants, and lawyers, have worked therefore intensively to develop the BAI PAI best practices presented today. We have done this for real estate and infrastructure, and we will do it for private equity and private debt also. The results of the first two asset classes are presented to you today, and we like to seek your input, your recommendations, or get your opinions or questions also during the consultation phase until 25th February of this year. Please feel also free to file an application to me if you are experienced with corporates. If you are experienced with private equity or private debt and would like to join this roundtable that will follow in the next few weeks. At this point, it's for me important, and I would like to thank you all the participants of the roundtables for investing so much time. Special thanks go to Jegor Tokarevich, my co-speaker today, who moderated the roundtables and prepared and followed up the papers you might have downloaded already. So I don't have to present you Jegor with all aspects you probably already know. He's CEO of Substance Over Form. He is a reporting and data expert, and he moderated, as I have mentioned before, our roundtables to develop these BAI best practices. I now hand over to him, and he will explain what we have done and what we plan to do. Jegor, the screen and the micro are yours, please.
Yes, Michael, thanks a lot, and hi everyone. A very warm welcome to our short webinar today and the intro to our PAI best practices and the first draft of it. So maybe I just try to, yes, it works very well. So maybe as a brief overview of what we've done so far. Michael has already said that what we did is we had a couple of practitioners from different sectors, from different areas with knowledge about the specifics of the relevant asset classes, which means real estate, which means infrastructure, and who also read the SFDR, obviously, and where we discussed different topics. And I think the first conclusion was that there are still many questions which are open. There is a lot of room for interpretation. And also within the group, we didn't always have the same view on things. And I guess it's normal, especially at the very beginning of a rather broad regulation. So what we did is every time we had any sort of different views on the same aspect, we summarized it accordingly, so that you basically have the results, the documented result of our brainstorming in the documents. And as you can see, we have two types of documents. So we have on this end here, you can see that we have a general guidance. So this document is summarizing aspects which are relevant for all KPIs and all asset classes, such as the timeline, the level of the look-through, the scope of KPIs, and so on. So that's is a good starting point to discuss the PAIs. And then you have here, and the links are basically working. So once you have it, you can click on those links and download the documents. You'll see here that you have actually the KPI by KPI analysis, where we really try to develop some sort of guidance and best practice for every single KPI we have here. And it's worth mentioning that obviously this is only our view on things, so it's not the right way to do it. It's just what we came up with after our brainstorming, and we hope that it gives a first starting point for the industry-wide discussion and standardization of the KPIs, because the more standardized, the easier, I think, for all of us. So if you have any questions, I just would like to mention what Michael said before. Please let us know. If you have other views, please let us know as well. And then I think we will make a big contribution to the standardization of industry practices. So what we do today is we're not going through all of the KPIs and all the work we did, because it would be a complete overkill, I guess, here in the 45 minutes we planned. But we're going to show you a couple of key points which will help you to work with those documents we prepared. And I'll start with the first point and the first question, namely the why. So why do we actually need to do PAI KPIs? And I think before we start with the regulatory purpose, I'd like to mention that if you're an asset manager, it could happen that there is an investor coming to you and wanting you to report KPIs, regardless if you have to do it or not. So it's a contractual requirement you might want to fulfill for your investor. So this is not covered here. And we're looking here at the regulatory purpose of the PAIs. And we identified two main reasons to report and consider PAIs. Whereas one of them is the actual, let's say, natural reason to report adverse impact, to make adverse impact disclosures, which are documented in the Article 4 and 7 of the SFDR, of the disclosure regulation. And on the other hand side here, we have a whole aspect of sustainable investments, where PAI is just one element of it. So its PAI are basically needed for the so-called do not significant assessment, being part of the sustainable investment disclosures. And those you will especially find in the Article 8 and 9, SFDR, and they have a bit of a different regulatory background. I'll explain how those two concepts are related in a second, because we also had a lot of discussions on how the Article 4 and 7 SFDR requirements are related to the Article 8 and 9 ones. This is a very big topic. We had a lot of conversations, also controversial conversations within the working group. But first of all, maybe a quick intro to what it is, for those who don't know. So in the Article 4, you basically need to disclose PAI on the entity level. So usually it's a must-have requirement for all large entities with over 500 employees. Based on Article 4, and only small entities with less than 500 employees can opt out. They can still do it on a voluntary basis, but they can opt out. And the key point here is that if you say that you basically are subject to Article 4, you need to calculate and disclose PAIs for all your investments. So you can't select that you do it for one investment, yes, and for the other one, no. You need to do it for all investments. So it's quite a heavy requirement, because it means that if you, let's say, if you're an asset manager with 50 billion euros assets under management, you need to do it for all your 50 billion euros assets under management, which is a big requirement. So I think many of the managers, at least right now, they opted out of it. But then there are some that must do it or want to do it. And let's say the good news here is that the format, the scope, and the frequency of the PAI disclosures here are more or less clear, at least based on the draft regulatory standard right now. So this one is more or less clearly defined, and we can look into something and we can sort of develop our guidance based on what we have here. The disclosures need to be done in 2023 based on the current draft. However, for the reference period 2022, so those of you who would like to do it in the Article 4 already need to collect and calculate PAI data now. So from the 1st of January 2022, because you'll have to disclose it in 2023. So it's quite an urgent topic for Article 4 entities. And on top of that, there are product level disclosures, and the product level disclosures are connected to the entity level. So if you are opted in, or if you have to do Article 4, then you also will need to do Article 7, which is the PAI disclosure on the product level, and it's mandatory. So Article 4 entities must do Article 7 disclosures. And you will see here that also the format, scope, and frequency are also more or less clear here. And the starting point is the 30th of December 2022, where in the pre and post contractual disclosures, PAI must be disclosed. And that's, I think, is a, let's say, like I said, more or less clear guidance and who has to do it and in which format. And for instance, in terms of the frequency, we also had a question. It says that you need to do it on a quarterly basis and disclose. So you need to calculate on a quarterly basis, but you need to disclose on a annual basis. It tells you that you have certain mandatory KPIs you must do, and then you have additional KPIs where you can pick from. So there are certain requirements with regards to the PAI reporting. This is a bit different for the sustainable investment disclosures, because in the sustainable investment, one element of being a sustainable investment is to do not significant harm. And this DNSH is basically one sub-element of the sustainable investment concept. And it can happen that you have a sustainable investment in the Article 8 product, if you want to do so. And it must happen in the Article 9 product, where you only have sustainable investments, basically. And DNSH is then a must-have obligation to prove the sustainable investment status. And there, DNSH refers to PAI. So they say, if you want to do DNSH, you have to do it with PAI. So in other words, if you want to make a sustainable investments based on the SFDR regulations, you have to use PAI to prove your DNSH. However, what is not very clear, and you see the question mark here, is it's not clear in which format does it have to be done. Is it also that I have to do it for that I have to do the same mandatory and additional KPIs as for Article 4 and 7, or can I pick and choose here? The frequency is not exactly clear how to do it. So with regards to the using of PAI in the sustainable investment concept, there are many question marks. And so our working group understanding was that the disclosures, at least, that you have to do here are not very quantitative, so they're rather qualitative, but we obviously need to wait for the last draft. And now I would like to mention a point which we discussed a lot in the working group, because one member basically said that all three concepts here, entity level PAI, product level PAI, and product level sustainable investment DNSH disclosures are interrelated, and referred to a BaFin webinar, where BaFin basically said that if you would like to disclose PAI on the product level for sustainable investments, you can only do this via the product level Article 7 disclosures, which in turn would mean you would need to do Article 4. So in other words, you want to make one sustainable investment, and it leads to the obligation to do Article 4 and Article 7 disclosures. And that was, of course, quite a big statement, because it would mean that many companies who currently opted out of Article 4 but still want to make sustainable investments need to opt in and basically do this whole part here. So many members were asking, is it really the case? And I think Frank Donzaifer from BAI had a chance to talk to BaFin and basically ask, right, Frank, if this is the case or not. So maybe, Frank, you can share a view on that.
Yes, so I briefly jump into the session, and indeed, I think Jegor already draw this slide correctly by having this broken line between the sustainable investment disclosures and the adverse impact disclosures. And so having the chance to talk to some of the sustainable finance staff of BaFin, I could informally pose the question and the relevance of and the interconnection of these provisions. And so this BaFin official said that there is no such a link, that the reporting under Article 8 with regard to TNSC would trigger the obligation to have here the full disclosure under Article 4. So there is no such optimism that one PAI or TNSC reporting would trigger or would opt out this or would preclude the option to opt out under Article 4. So they see it also as a different concept, the disclosure under Article 8 and 9 and Article 4 and 7. And I think this is a plausible approach. But of course, it's up to formal discussions also with other authorities, so that we have a uniform understanding, not just here within Germany, but also on European level.
Thanks, Frank. I think that's good news to hear, first of all. I think what is worth mentioning is just that there is still at least some residual regulatory risk that if you make sustainable investments, it could happen that it can trigger Article 4 and 7. So then you need to basically do PAI for all your investments and products. However, based on what Frank has just said, there is also, let's say, the more favorable interpretation where there is a big line between those two concepts, and you can make sustainable investments and calculate PAI for those particular investments rather than for all of your assets under Article 4 and 7. So that much for the theory and the discussions we had in the working group. So I think it's important for the industry to be aware of this topic. And now let's move on to the from the theory more and more towards the practice. And as you may know, under the current draft of the SFDR, we have 3 categories. We have sovereigns and supranationals. So this we ignore in this webinar. And then we have 2 categories such as investee companies and real estate assets. And what is worth mentioning is that there is nothing else. So since we are looking at real estate and infrastructure, the question was, which category do I apply to my assets? And I think the starting point for us was actually because you don't have anything else, you have only those 3 categories. And I think the general point for real estate was, I think, clear that real estate falls under real estate. So not many discussions there. But what about the infrastructure? Because infrastructure is not really a real estate, and is also not really an investee company if I have a bridge, for example, right? The answer here was that we also discussed if we could argue that there is no requirement to calculate PAI for infrastructure. However, I think the majority of the group concluded that no PAI is not an option, because it would go towards greenwashing probably. So we need to, the general understanding of our group was that for all assets you have, you need to calculate PAI. For infrastructure, it is tricky because there is no appropriate category. But still, our understanding is that still we need to make infrastructure somehow fit into one of those 2 categories. And I'm going to discuss it in a second. You might remember that there are 2 types of PAI. One are mandatory and the other ones are additional ones. On the real estate side, we have significantly less PAIs and significantly less discussions, to be honest, also how to apply them. So we have only 2 mandatory and 8 additional ones. Whereas on the investee companies, we have a whole bunch of PAIs. We have 17 mandatory and 37 additional ones. So don't blame me if you count them differently. It depends how you count those PAIs, but this is at least based on our Excel list you'll find is how we calculated the amount of PAIs. And what we can see is that obviously the difficult or the amount of work you need for investee companies is significantly higher than the one that you need for real estate assets as a starting point. So that's the starting point. So now let's discuss which category do we apply to which asset class and how do we do that. And
Jegor, perhaps I might interrupt you. We've got a question with regard to slide 6. Would you like to try to answer it now or at the end?
Maybe we do at the end because we
Okay.
are sort of, if that's okay.
Okay, sure.
If that's fine with you, because we're already sort of in the on the jump to the actual look-through topic, and so we're gonna come back to your questions in a short while. So let's go to the first big question that we have here, namely the level of the look-through. So the big question in the corporate, we don't have this big question in the corporate world, because in the corporate world you have a corporate and that's it. But if you think about project finance structures such as real estate or infra projects, you usually have a fund. The fund invests into some sort of a holding company. This one invests into an operating or property company, and then there is a real asset. So you have at least 4 levels. So the question is, on which level do I actually make my assessment? And the draft RTS currently states that in general, it's important that you look through funds and SPVs. So our understanding for real estate was that we need to look through all those structures and basically make the assessment on the level of the real asset. So this could be an office or an hotel or even a university. So then you would calculate the PAIs on the level of this real asset object, not on the level of the holding company or operating company. And on this real estate object would be assessed in the category real estate, which I think is clear. So we didn't really have any sort of discussions here, I guess. That was quite clear. However, we had a lot of discussions in terms of infrastructure projects, because as we said, for infrastructure project, there is no PAI category. So the question was, how do I do it if I don't have an appropriate category? And we had 3 options, 3 alternatives we identified when we discussed it with our members. And one was to basically look through everything, because it's the requirement here, and to take the real asset, so a bridge or an onshore wind farm, and basically to apply the PAIs of the investee company to this bridge or to this onshore wind farm. And that's a bit tricky, because you'll realize that if you do that, then some investee company PAIs are not applicable, because, for instance, a bridge or an onshore wind farm has no employees, has no policies, so it's a bit difficult, especially to apply social PAIs. So if you want to apply, let's say, the gender pay gap for a bridge, it's difficult because a bridge has no employees or has no board members. So that's a bit of the tricky situation if you do it on the real asset level. Another point is not to look through to the real asset, but to stay on the level of the, let's say, operating company, and say the operating company is a company. So I apply the investee company PAIs on the level of the OpCo. The problem there is that we actually must look through, so we will not fulfill the look-through requirement. And another problem is that on the OpCo level, you don't really have a lot of activities happening. So you maybe have 2 board members. They often have no salaries. So many KPIs, especially the social KPIs, are not really applicable also to those board members, because a lot of outsourcing is happening to other service providers. So again, this is an option to stay on the level of the OpCo, but again, there are also many questions in terms of how do I apply certain investee company PAIs. And then we had one member who came up with an alternative suggestion by saying that actually none of the investee companies PAIs apply to infrastructure. So why don't we interpret the term real estate in a broader sense as not a real estate, but basically real asset? So that is one interpretation we got also from a member of the group. So basically what the member is doing is they're applying real estate PAIs to the real assets, to the infrastructure real assets. So they measure the adverse impacts with real estate PAIs for a bridge, which again, is it right? Is it wrong? We don't know, but this is what came up out of our brainstorming session with the members. So you see infrastructure, many questions of the level, because none of the categories we have are really applicable to infrastructure. So we need to be creative, and we hope that we get some guidance in the final version, because otherwise it's going to be a challenging task here. So and in our documents, by the way, you'll find those differences, different applications where we try to summarize the different ways of application. So another topic we had is the topic of activities, because there are activities on different levels. So the question is, on which activity do I actually measure the PAI, and how far do I need to look through in the value chain? So here you see a typical project finance transaction where you have an OpCo which owns or leases a real asset, so a real estate or a bridge. In my example, it has some directors, SPV directors, but usually the majority of activities are outsourced. So there are construction companies, operations and maintenance providers, manufacturers, they do different things, and there is a client, so who's basically paying the revenues. And now the question is, on which level do I actually assess the PAI? And I think for the real estate, we were discussing, if you have a PAI such as involvement in let's say adverse activities. So for instance, coal or oil, let's say. So the question is, if I have an office and this office is rented by an oil company, is the office involved in it, in the oil activity or not? Or if I have a even bigger example, if I have an hotel, and then you have sometimes oil company employees coming and staying there for a couple of days, or maybe having a conference there or something. So do I need to look through the company on the level of the tenant or not? And we realize that it's a difficult topic, and based on our understanding, you need to look at the narrow narrow definition of the activity. So if an office, the narrow activity of an office is to provide a rental space, and this is the level of the activity without looking through the tenant. Because another point is that if you look through the tenant and you consider the PAIs of the tenant, then a double counting might occur, because the tenant would have the PAI and the office would have the tenant, the PAI of the tenant. So you would consider the PAI on both levels. So again, that's a bit of a question on which level do you actually measure the PAI. However, our understanding was that in the context of real estate, we'd only focus on the narrow real estate activity without looking through on the value chain of this particular real asset. Infrastructure is more trickier because, as we said, we don't have real estate PAIs, but we have maybe investee company PAIs. And if we use investee company PAIs, then it's quite difficult to apply certain PAIs on the level of the real asset. So if you do not apply the investee company PAIs on the level of the real asset, and you apply them on the level of the OpCo, again, the question is, do I then need to consider also my service providers or not? So if I would like to count, I don't know, the gender pay gap, for example, do I need to calculate the gender pay gap on the level of the OpCo, so on the SPV directors, which maybe will have some numbers which are not really representative for my construction side, or my operational side? Or do I need to consider the gender pay gaps of all those service providers, which again, we have then the issue of the double counting. We have the issue that part of the activities of those providers are not relevant for my particular project. So very, very tricky, the question here. So we don't know. The answer is we don't know on which level to do that. But we summarized a couple of different approaches, and we hope that we'll get some guidance at some point by the regulators. And we ask you also to provide this feedback to the industry, to the associations, to the regulators, because we need some guidance here. Otherwise, we'll have a very diverse application of those PAIs. Now, last but not least, 2 examples, and then we do the questions just of what you'll find in the which type of technical discussions or technical examples you'll find in our Excels that you can download. So here is one for real estate, and there is a PAI, which is an energy consumption in gigawatt hours per square meter. So, and now if you go deep into the KPI, you'll encounter many different questions. So the starting point is, where do I get the data? So we also wrote which data would we use in order to calculate it. So you see here, in order to get the energy consumption, our asset managers who are doing real estate on a daily basis said there are 2 ways. One is I get a regular assessment from monthly data. I get monthly data, for example, from my smart meters. So basically, you have a monthly assessment, and you can use those values. But then you have others that are saying that we don't have smart meters, we just have an annual energy bill. And once you have an annual energy bill, then of course you have the question, okay, but how do I break it down on a quarterly basis, because I need to calculate it on a quarterly basis. So those are, you see, very detailed technical aspects you need to consider. Then the type means, do I calculate it once for the whole project lifetime, or do I change it on a regular basis? And we see that in both cases we need to do it on a dynamically, because it will change. How do we calculate it? So this one I think is easy, because we need to calculate the periodic gigawatt hours and divide them by the square meters of the relevant area. But then we have 2 questions. One is, if I don't calculate the direct emissions, the direct GWH for a period, for a quarterly period, but I have annual data. So how do I get the quarterly data then? Because there is a requirement, as we understand, that you need to do it on a quarterly basis. So if you would like to make an estimate, we said there is no better way that we came up with than to just calculate 1/4 of the annual value. So you just have an assumption of a linear consumption. So that's also what we mentioned when if there is some estimate needed. And another point, which is I think is even a bigger one, is what is actually an area. And then we spoke to different participants, and they realized that we have different definitions of areas. Some define a net area, others define a gross area. Then we have plenty of industry standards, they define their own areas. So there are many definitions of an area. However, they're not in the regulatory framework. And of course, if you use different values here in the denominator, then if you use a larger value, then you may appear more efficient than you use a smaller value. So there is a greenwashing risk, because the higher the area, the better you have the KPI value. So that's a bit of a topic which is which we don't know now, but at least we show that there is a question, and there is also a greenwashing risk. So if you'd like to avoid the greenwashing risk, consider that there is some when you have this sort of topics here. So you see highly technical topics and kind of data source, estimates, and definitions of certain metrics. But at least in the real estate, we know on which level are we talking about and which data are we using. If we look at an example for infrastructure, that is different, because on the infrastructure level, let's take a good one here, an unadjusted gender pay gap of investee companies. And if we decide to use the pay gap KPI on the level of the investee companies, then of course the question is, okay, first of all, again, on which level do I use it? Do I use it on the level of the real asset, so on the onshore wind farm, or on the level of the SPV, or on the level of the service provider, so what we had before? So first of all, we said, where do we get the data about the salaries, first of all? And the answer is, well, if it's on the SPV level, I get it from the payroll of the directors. If it's on the level of the service provider, I get it hopefully from their ESG reporting. So then I can use the data. The type is obviously will depend on the approach, and I'm gonna come to it in a second. How do we calculate it? So basically, this is a formula. So in a nutshell, we just basically take the male earnings minus female earnings. So we get a gap. We calculate the gap between the male earning and the female earning. So how much, if it's positive, it means males earn more. If it's negative, it means females earn more. If it's zero, it means they earn the same. And we divide it by the males. And then we can see basically the percentage, there is a percentage value that shows the gender pay gap as defined by this KPI. So now the question is, how do I calculate it for a bridge? And that's a tricky one, as I said, because the approach one, which we discussed, is if I apply the investee company KPI on the level of the bridge, then there are different ways of doing it because it's not really applicable. So some participants said, maybe we just say 0 because a bridge has no pay gap because it has no employees. Another participant said, why don't we have an NA? The problem if you have an NA is then it's difficult to aggregate it on the portfolio level because you want to aggregate it. So many questions in terms of methods how to do it. If you do it on the level of of the company and not on the level of the real asset, again the question is, does it actually make sense to calculate it on the level of the SPV? Because on the SPV you have directors, they're probably working full-time somewhere else, so they have no salaries. Or do you need to take to calculate it on the level of the material service providers? So for instance, the construction company is construction the material activity, or on the level of the owned M provider. But then again, we might have a double counting. So again, and how do I aggregate the data of different service providers? Because each of them will have different gender pay gaps. So you see, that's an example where it shows how difficult it is to do it for infrastructure infrastructure assets if you apply investee company KPIs. So we formulated our approaches here, and we hope that you have a look, you ask questions. If you have better ideas, you let us know, and especially that we clarify it in the next sort of draft that we hopefully get at some point, where they consider at least some of those material topics. And with that in mind, so those are only 2 examples. We have examples for all possible KPIs, so have a look. We try to cover as many KPIs as possible. And that brings me actually to the summary, and then we go to the questions. So to quickly summarize, PAI, there are different regulatory purposes which may be connected, but for now, at least, based on what we understood from BaFin, they're not. So based on what Frank said before, so you see here there is a reason to do it based on the adverse impact, where everything is more or less clear, or if you do it for sustainable investments in the Article 809 as part of DNSH assessment, and there are a lot of questions because there is no clear guidance here. Then there is a lot of room for interpretation for real estate and especially infrastructure. On which level do we do this? On the OpCo, HoldCo, the real asset? On which activity level? Do I look through the tenant? Do I look through the service provider? What is the right KPI to choose? So for real estate, it's real estate, but what is it for infrastructure? Do I take the real estate or the infrastructure KPI? And then within every single KPI, there are also questions such as, how do I calculate the area? Which area do I take, net or gross? How do I calculate the KPIs which are not applicable? Can I put a 0 or a 1 or an A or nothing? So what do I do with those? And of course, the data quality. So can I use estimates or do you use the real final values? And there is a lot of judgment right now. So let's be clear, it's definitely not an exact science right now. So, and I think the judgment, what was our orientation in terms of the judgment? Our orientation was the regulatory requirements, clearly. But then if it's not clear what is in the regulatory framework, we were trying to assess the results based on the greenwashing risk, because that's what we want to avoid. So if there is a greenwashing risk with a certain interpretation, let's use a different interpretation. Does it make sense? So is it operationally feasible? And in some cases, it's not. And the double counting aspect, as we said, because if you start double counting on different levels, on the service provider and the level of the SPV, for instance, then it's probably not the right way. So the question is, if I do that, does somebody else count the same PAI on some other level? And we try to avoid this double counting here. So that's, I think, is the summary. So the next steps for us is please provide us with the feedback. Please send us your questions or your remarks, and also spread the word to the associations, to the industries, to the investors, downside, upside, that we see that there are plenty of questions and we need definitely a better guidance on the regulatory level. And also apply for with Michael for our next roundtables for the corporates, where we're going to discuss the same questions for private equity and private debt. And that much from my side, Michael, and I don't know if we have some questions we'd like to discuss now, because I don't see any questions here.
Thank you very much, Jegor, for this short but excellent tour d'horizon through this quite complex materia. Indeed, we have some questions. First is, so we have two PAI categories for real estate and investee companies, but not for infrastructure yet. So one participant asks if there are any news from the ESAs, if and when there will be infrastructure-specific PAI. I don't have any information on this. I suggest you do not have either, or
we haven't had anything in the last meetings of our working group. I think somebody had a rumor that they might have heard something, but with, so far there is nothing we can refer to or show. So for now, I think we should prepare for the worst case, that there is no specific PAI for the infrastructure project.
Then we have two questions concerning slide 6. So probably you go to slide 6. So the first is about the TNSC disclosure for sustainable investments. Does it mean only disclosing PAI indicators, or does it require to define thresholds or benchmarks for individual PAIs that need to be met by investments?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think there are two things. It means both based on my understanding, because on the one hand side, you need to disclose certain things. And as we said, our understanding is that you do not need to, based on this requirement, at least that's what we wrote after the discussion of our guidance, that you do not need to provide a list of, under this requirement, you do not need to provide the list of all PAIs in the template. You need to explain in a narrative how you considered the PAI in the DNSH. In terms of not the disclosure, but the doing part, so the operational part, the understanding is that if you would like to show that you're not causing any significant harm, you're not doing any significant harm, I think the logical consequence is that you need to define triggers and limits. Because let's say you calculate a number for a PAI, or you calculate the 17 PAIs, and one is 7, another one is a yes, and the third one is a no. So how is it an evidence that you are not causing, or you're causing a significant harm? Obviously, you need to translate the value of the PAI into the result. And so the result is significant harm, yes or no. So somehow you need to, and the only way of doing that is basically to define triggers, which are, by the way, also not prescribed. So nobody tells you what is a good value of GHG emission scope 1, 2, 3. So there, I think you need to come up with something, and maybe use some orientation, maybe from the taxonomy, from some other frameworks. But then the good news is that some KPIs, they have quite clear triggers, because they are, for example, yes or no. They have yes or no values. If you have a yes or no value, then sometimes yes is a bad value, no is a good value, or yes is a good value, no is a bad value. So there, I think it's clear. But for everything else, the understanding is yes, you will need to have triggers.
Okay, then with regard to the level of disclosure, there is a participant that asks if there is an entity that will audit ESG reporting and check if reporting happened on the correct level.
Well, there is it depends on the requirements. So under the SFDR, my understanding is that, especially with the new and that we also discussed, by the way, in our working group, there is this new, at least in Germany, audit paper, so issued by the Auditors Association of Germany, and it basically already started last year. where auditors started looking into those topics, and they defined, let's say, topics where they're going to look with a higher priority, and then others where they're going to look with a lower priority. And my understanding is that classifications or disclosures of sustainable investments, meaning Article 8 for sustainable investments and Article 9, is part of the higher priority topics. So it is, my understanding is highly likely that the auditor might ask, so here you're saying you have, I don't know, 80% sustainable investments. So how did you arrive at this value? And if you start asking this question, the next question is, how did you arrive at the DNSH? And then the next question is, how did you arrive at the PAI that you need to use for the DNSH? So probably it's going to be the case.
Okay, thank you for that. Still, with regard to this slide, so there is a question: if we need to collect the PAI KPIs as part of due diligence pre-investment, for example, to fulfilling the TNSC criteria for sustainable investments, or if the KPIs are only applicable to investment already made ex post?
Well, if you, it depends again. So if you have an investment strategy, and in the investment strategy you say you will make sustainable investments, and you would like to make a sustainable investment. So obviously you need to know before the investment if this investment is sustainable or not. So if you would like to make the sustainable investment in the pre-investment phase, then you will need to make a sustainable investment assessment. And one element of the sustainable investment assessment will be DNSH. And in DNSH, you probably will collect the relevant PAIs, and you will benchmark it against certain limits in order to determine, am I doing a significant harm or not? So my understanding is you'll also have to do it pre-investment for sustainable investments, so for this right piece here, and also post-investment, because you need to not do significant harm on a regular basis. On this level here with Article 4 and 7, the requirement is on the level of the investment decision. So when do you make an investment decision? Obviously, pre-investment is an investment decision. And on an ongoing basis, I mean, you also make investment decisions, plus you have the requirement to regularly disclose PAI on an annual basis and calculate them on a quarterly basis. So yes, the understanding is, I guess, for both categories, it's on a regular basis as well as on a pre-investment basis. I think that the point is always, where does the requirement come from? So I think that you need to always find the starting point. So is it Article 4.7, is it Article 8.9, or is it a contractual requirement? So let's say you're an asset manager, you have an insurance company, and then the insurance company tells you, I just want you to report PAI on a regular basis. Then you don't need to do it probably pre-investment, you just need to report it on a regular basis. But that again is defined in your side letter. That has nothing to do with regulations. It's a contractual private agreement. This is different, of course, for the regulatory from the regulatory purposes ones.
Probably another question with regard to infrastructure under Article 9 SFDR. So how can the manager be certain that an asset, so a portfolio company, meets the criteria of Article 9? Would one require a legal opinion to certify that the asset meets the relevant criteria, or are there other ways?
Well, the requirement is to do that is with the financial market participant based on the SFDR. And it's the financial market participant who needs to provide evidence that it's something is a sustainable investment. So how the financial market participant does it internally with an external legal opinion is up to the FMP right now.
The draft RTS SFDR allows for other KPIs. So the question is, would it be possible to define additional new KPIs for infra assets on an individual basis?
Additional infra, sorry, I didn't get it, Michael.
So if it is possible, just to define by ourselves additional new KPIs for infrastructure asset on an individual basis.
Okay, so the participant would define their own KPI, so they would come up with their own KPI. Well, this is definitely possible, but has nothing to do with the PAI based on the SFDR. So this is just your regular, or your voluntary reporting, your additional service for the investor, as your investor report, for example, whatever you write in there. But it will not resolve your regulatory questions. So I'm not aware of a provision saying that you can define your own KPIs.
Okay, I think with regard to the time, let's stop for the moment. But as you have asked and as you have told, we are furthermore open for questions, for all questions. So write us an email, call us, reach out for any questions, recommendations, suggestions. We are open for everything. So for the moment, it is the end of this webinar, but not for our webinars in whole. So already next week, we will start a short series on investment outlooks with regard to alternative asset classes. So please join if you want, and join us whenever we are so whenever we offer you other ESG topics. So for a moment, Jegor, I think that's it from our side.
Yes, many thanks for the excellent questions. And as we said, please let us know your ideas, your remarks, and we'll collect them, and then we're going to publish, let's say, the final first draft, and hopefully the remarks we made here, also the complexities, will be addressed on the EU level at some point. Thanks a lot, and have a great day.
Thanks a lot. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.